What we wanted to do is talk a little bit today about LED screen technology that we've been working on. What we tried to do was actually take LED technology and integrate it into a workflow that imagined how would an independent or low-budget filmmaker make a film. So what we tried to do was, in some of the tests that you're going to see with Erik, is integrate in an environment that did not have all the resources that typically come with the large-scale film production. What we really wanted to see was what happens, how far can you push this technology and still give the filmmakers the tools that they need to be able to craft their story. What we assumed was how do you make this technology work inside of stages that were not purpose-built for this, inside of warehouses. We gave ourselves a limited film crew. We gave ourselves limited access to the amount of resources, and we really wanted to push the real-time technology, the graphics that usually come with this. But we wanted to push this to an area that said, how do we give filmmakers, maybe potentially in Queens or Manhattan, who are working in a small stage, how do we bring the Himalayas to that little sound stage? How do we bring Mongolia? How do we bring the Serengeti of Africa to a team that may have a fewer amount of resources than some of the larger scale operations? So this was an opportunity for us to be able to sort of break those boundaries. And so just wanted to turn that over to Erik and have him walk you through some of the tests that we've done.
Cool. Thanks, David. And hello, everybody. I mean, this was really a test that we sort of self-funded. David, you asked me to throw together something to bash on this for a bit. Let's see kind of what we can do in the arena of virtual production using the in-camera effects that maybe take us into a slightly different arena than a lot of the things that we've been seeing around the globe in a lot of the various tests and demos that have been done. Because when I look at some of that work, I see a lot of maybe static environments or cameras that are following somebody who's sitting or standing in a forest or a desert. And the thought was, what could we do maybe to try and see what happens in a much more dynamic environment when you're moving rapidly through space. And so we've got some imagery here, trying something with an Avro Lancaster World War II kind of story, because we happen to know a guy who's got a thing. The sort of snippet that I ultimately sort of came up with, given the constraints of how much wall real estate we are going to have to be able to use, how much, what our sort of camera footprint or what our camera package was going to be, what our crew, potentially was going to be, what kind of story, or not even a short film here, like what sort of maybe little narrative vignettes could we come up with, and come up with a number of different camera setups that would tell a compelling maybe action sequence that takes place in the skies over Germany or over northern France. So ultimately where we landed with this is I sort of came up with two scenarios. One, maybe a high altitude night raid someplace over Germany where we're in the skies, there's searchlights, these guys come under attack by flak cannons and ultimately need to get to their target, drop their bombs and get out of there.
Look at those fires. I've never seen anything quite like it. Looks like it was a direct hit over the target. Bloody hell. They'll remember tonight. Yes, that's the idea.
Coming to the end of the night piece, what do we do if we change up the situation a bit and move on to a daytime sequence? What does this mean for us as far as incorporating actual daylight, sunlight, with a stage that maybe wasn't all-encompassing, that really completely surrounded you? How far could we push the idea of getting believable illumination into this warehouse space that only had maybe 3 panels that we could use on this thing?
Another one on our tail! How many are there? Can you see? I think 2 of them. Christ, that was close. There. Watch this one here. Yes,
I guess the goal of this, first of all, was let's see what sort of situations, how many different setups can we come up with, but also working within the restraints of the resources that we're going to have available to us. What kind of a story can you tell? How do you stage these sequences in a way that might be compelling? And also, I guess as a way to sort of bash on the technology with Unreal. In some of these instances, I might lean towards, well, let's do an aerial shoot, let's say, and capture some footage and put it up on a screen behind these guys and see what we can do in camera. But the goal of this here was, well, how far can we actually push the Unreal side of things if we generate everything dynamically? Can we come up with believable imagery? And the thing that was really great about this particular scenario, it sort of gave us a sandbox that we could play in without maybe the pressures that would come from an actual production where there were, some pretty hardcore expectations from a filmmaker who, we would know that these images need to be absolutely flawless, absolutely convincing. And I think what, the imagery that we just looked at, I wouldn't say is, everything, did we knock it out of the park in every single setup? I don't think the answer is yes there, but the thing that was interesting is we were sort of testing the boundaries, pushing against it and seeing, what is actually possible there. So I guess moving on to some of this, some of the supporting material here. So Peter Jackson was kind enough to loan us his Lancaster cockpit section, took it to the car wash and dusted it off. And that sort of gave us a very sizable set piece to sort of work in here. So, we had a digital asset from a decade ago. We were working on this Lancaster project a long time ago. The trick, of course, here was that this was a hero asset that was made for very close detail, high resolution, offline rendering situations. So, of course, the first step was we had to take that asset in. We had to sort of make it performant in a game engine scenario. And then looking at our specific hardware constraints for this. Now, the vendor we were working with here locally, for this test, because again, this was all sort of self-funded, we didn't have vast amount of financial resources to do this. What we worked out was, well, we had basically 40 square meters of a high-res panel product that we could use. We had about 60 square meters of a lower resolution panel product that could form our ceiling and maybe an off-camera wall to give us illumination. So effectively, I knew going into this that we were going to have 3 sides of a cube. And given that restriction, what did that mean? First of all, we've got an actual full-size aircraft, or at least the front section of, to place in front of this thing. In the previous presentation, the mention of moire, well, here it is, right? Even the high-res panels we had for this project weren't the absolute bleeding-edge, highest resolution product available. I believe, the sort of state-of-the-art at the moment is around 2.8, and there's new panels that have just come out that are 2.5 millimeters per pixel. What we're looking at here for our high-res in-camera product was only 3.6. So already, we've got ourselves in a situation where we can't get as far back from the wall as we would have liked because of the size of the aircraft that we're trying to film. We can't, we already have, pixels that are bigger than we would have ideally liked. That gets us into the question, well, what's our camera resource available for this? And we reached out to our friends in Australia at Erik, saying, hey, we've got this project coming up, we're going to do this test. Would you guys be interested in participating? And they were absolutely fantastic. Said, yep, well, whatever you need. They sent us a mini LF and 6 of their beautiful signature primes for this test, which was great because I specifically for this wanted a large format sensor, knowing that we were going to need to push the depth of field more than we may normally want to on this. And for the other reason that, having a small footprint camera like this was going to allow us to get it into really squeezy cockpits. You can sort of see here in our camera sort of testing prior to the shoot that we actually could cram this thing right into the corner. Of course, on the day, this was all operated handheld. And that was another aspect that we really wanted to explore with this project was, if everything was, if we didn't have these nice smooth camera moves, we wanted to keep, the whole thing about this, because we didn't have this aircraft on a 6-axis gimbal in front of the screen, all of this sort of movement was going to have to come from our actors and from our camera to sort of bring that energy to these shots. And speaking with the actors, of course, a real Lancaster crew consisted of 7 airmen. We had for our test available 2 guys. We had 2 local actors that we brought in for this, and one of them got to do double duty as 2 different roles. But the thing that was fantastic is, of course, this subject matter, the war being as significant as it was, there's just a wealth of information out there as I started to do research about these scenarios of coming up with the initial plan for this in the first place. So from that research, landed again at we'll do a high altitude bombing run over Germany. This was, one of those sort of inspirational images that sort of lit into that. And the daytime thing, now doing some research around actual, daytime raids that had happened in the war, one thing that I was sort of finding was that, well, actually these guys would have been just above treetop height to try and stay under German radar as they were getting, flying in towards their target, which instantly goes, well, that actually is really kind of a compelling scenario, because that gives us the sort of dynamic, because we're so low to the ground, everything's sort of whizzing by the windows underneath, and it felt like that would put us in a pretty great spot to try a lot of, sort of, let's see how far we can push real-time performance on this. And so given the camera system, given those scenarios, given the kind of coverage that we can actually get, it started, first of all, figuring out what kind of coverage could we do, and it's sort of effectively driving scene. You're sort of covering this the same way you might be shooting two characters talking in a car as they're going someplace, except that we're going to be doing it in the sky and we're going to be getting shot at while it's happening. Given that, I sort of narrowed that list down to about 15 different setups as we're going through here. And that led us into the sort of a scenario that, given that we had relatively limited real estate as far as the screens go, it also meant that every time we wanted to turn around, we were also going to have to be turning the plane or moving screens, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But going into this, first of all, we also needed to fill out this content with something. And so this is where I had, a couple of years ago, I put together a pipeline where I could actually fly in virtual reality in a flight simulator and treat that as mocap. And so because this whole thing was about aircraft, it felt like a really great, great way to utilize that again. So here we go. I'm flying around in a Lancaster. I'm flying around in a Messerschmitt Bf-109 and taking those motion paths, and then in post, or sort of in prep, taking those into Maya, chopping up into individual pieces, and choreographing those flight paths so that the aircrafts intersect with each other in compelling ways. And the thing that was really great about doing it this way was that, unlike a keyframe scenario, you actually allow yourself the possibility for serendipity. There were moments of those happy accidents where you didn't realize that you had two other bombers that were above you at this moment. Once you put a camera on that in the cockpit, you can see reflections of those things through the Perspex canopy. All those kind of unexpected things that maybe you wouldn't have thought of in a keyframe scenario all come into play in the same way that it would have if you actually had somehow the budget to have 15 Lancasters flying in the skies with each other. That sort of at least gave us our motion, which drove all this. And then alongside that, our team here in the Special Projects group at Weta started looking at building this world that these could exist within. What we're seeing here was a really early test where we grabbed some actual aerial photography of some clouds that we had in the library from a few years back, and coupled that with real-time terrain that is in the Unreal Engine. So these two things are coexisting. Interesting hybrid approach of taking real photography and mixing that in the engine. But the thing is that sort of hinges on the fact that we've got all of the right angles that we need for all of our setups of these clouds, which probably wasn't going to be the case. But more than that, that was a little bit against the spirit of what we were trying to do here, because the goal was ultimately, let's see what we can do within Unreal specifically. So shifted gears a little bit, put that idea on the shelf, and took a look at, well, let's take the plane right down to the deck. Let's give ourselves an early morning kind of sunrise scenario. And this is an early test. And when I look at this, the clouds haven't had the attention to detail quite put in them yet. The plane is flying quite a bit too fast, but it seemed like this is going to be something that ultimately could work out pretty nicely for us. That content was all getting put together. I think we had a team of about 6 artists that were working on this. And I think the time from conception to the time we actually shot was probably 7 or 8 weeks from memory. When we actually got to the shoot day, and we actually had budgeted for 3 days for the actual shoot itself, you're seeing the scenario that we were working with here. So every time, as I said before, that every time that we had to turn around, it also meant that we were physically turning around. And so all hands on deck, everybody starts pushing, and we could get the plane into the new position to shoot through the opposite window or to shoot through the front windscreen at the content that we had on our in-camera wall. And it actually worked out surprisingly well. I mean, I guess the concern I had going into this was that because we were having to shift things around, what was that ultimately going to mean for us in terms of setup time and reset up every time we moved? Because in the past, something like this would have meant that once we've shifted everything, now we've got to break out the survey tools. We've got to actually figure out where things are in 3D world space again and reconfigure everything in the engine. But our mocap developers came up with a really fantastic idea here, which was to put QR codes up on all the screens. And you can see a witness camera there in the foreground. So this witness camera was being tracked by the mocap system that was tracking our motion picture camera. We could basically point this thing at the screens. It knew exactly the orientation and the position relative to the aircraft, and we could, within 15 minutes, be ready to shoot again. And so that really helped us make our day. It was absolutely kind of essential to making our day, in fact. Here's a minute 16 walkthrough of the entire process from the moment that we set up all the way through the moment that we packed out again. And you'll notice as we're going through this that once we actually get into shooting, everything actually was moving relatively smoothly throughout the day. We actually were ahead of schedule on our first day, which was kind of unheard of. I was fully expecting us to be behind and maybe not even make the full shoot, but I think given all the tools that we had given ourselves on this and the prep time, and that was the key thing with this was, I think we had the walls available to us for about 3 weeks, which was absolutely invaluable to the team, because going into this, we had a lot of theories about the way we wanted to approach the color science aspect of it and the color management to make sure that our final pixels were going to be recorded the way that we wanted to see them through the motion picture camera. There were questions of sync and how we're going to manage all those things. Questions of how the light quality was going to interact with the live action components of this. And having all that time to prep was absolutely kind of key to the success of everything we had. Going into it now, projects that are in progress at the moment and future projects that we're talking about, the thing is that now that we've sort of answered these questions for ourselves, we wouldn't need that kind of that sort of prep lead-in period, because the technology stack has already sort of been has been effectively worked out. We've answered those questions, and so I guess as far as questions go, what did we learn from all this? There were a lot of pretty interesting things that came out of this the process of going through this test, and one of them was, what is the color workflow? Now, as far as I can tell, there are currently two kind of schools of thought about how you're going to prep your content, whether that content is coming from live action photography or whether that content is coming from a game engine or other sort of real-time engine. One of those says, what the diagram we're seeing here, you take your content, you sort of prep it for your creative intent, and you put it directly like that so that it looks exactly that way on the LED walls. You photograph that, and in theory, everything comes out the other end exactly as you had expected it. But as was mentioned in the previous presentation, the LED walls are probably not going to be the only light source that you're working with here. You're going to want to bring in additional, practical lighting fixtures, and as soon as you do that, that becomes a fairly complicated equation in terms of working out how you need to. In the case of my example here, I've taken a daylight scene, but I've tinted it steely blue because that's the sort of post-apocalyptic feel that I want for this scene. Because I've baked that footage in, now I need to sort of gel all my lights or adjust my LED fixture, my practical LED fixtures, my sky panels and that sort of thing to sort of work in the equation. By contrast, the other workflow that we use here and that seems to be working very well is the idea that we're not baking that sort of cool blue look, let's say, into the imagery that we're putting on the walls. Instead, we're saying we want to prep that material so that the light that's coming off the LED panels is effectively absolute light, the way that it would have looked if you were actually standing on that location on the day. And at that point, it's up to your DP to sort of make those decisions about how they want to record that with the motion picture camera. And in the example here, we're saying, well, I'm going to change the white balance of my camera so that instead of getting something that looks neutral, I want to get that steely blue look. Well, that's a decision your DP can now make, on the day. And the great thing with this is that all of your practical fixtures, your HMIs, your tungsten lamps that you want to place in your set, your LED, sky panel fixtures, and that sort of thing, all of those, the way you would work with those would be exactly the same as how you would work with them in an actual daylight scenario or an actual sort of tungsten lit scenario. So this isn't something necessarily that a director is going to need to specifically know about, but it's a consideration that you need to know going into this, that there are some conversations that your DP needs to have with your virtual production supervisor, your VFX team, about how you want to handle this color in your sort of pre-production process so that when you do get to that step, you don't lose any time about figuring out why it doesn't look correct. The other thing that, speaking of the light quality, the LED light sources As amazing as they are, and the possibilities that they open up is everything that everybody has been saying that it is. But there is a thing that needs to be considered in that you can put imagery on the wall, you can rephotograph it with your motion picture camera, and you can get exactly the look that you were intending. But the tricky thing is, until the technology takes another step forward, the reality is that the way that the LED panels are constructed, the kind of light that they're putting out in the world, the way that interacts with real people and real sets can give you some slightly unexpected results. Now, if you compare, for example, if you compare the actual spectral properties of the LED panels to daylight, you can see how much of the color spectrum is actually not present in the LED walls. And what that means is that if this is the way that a color chart is supposed to look under sunlight, this is the way that color chart might look under the LED walls, which seems absolutely bonkers, but this is actually what we observe. This is pure white light coming off the LED walls, and you can see how vibrant those colors are skewing. And we see that same thing. Here's some outtakes from the daytime scenario. And what you notice is that we have an HMI lamp on our set here, which is sort of giving us our sunlight. Where that HMI is hitting these guys on the key side of their face, things look pretty much the way you'd expect. But if you look at the fill side of their face, everybody's skin tones are going a bit purpley, a bit magenta, and that is entirely just down to a function of the way that the LED light is going in. Now, knowing that this is an issue, you can certainly go in, your DB can bring additional, higher quality fixtures like sky panels, or using, say, HMIs or other sort of high quality lighting fixtures and sort of help counteract that. Or you can say, we just accept that this is going to be the case, and we're going to take a pass in the DI, and we're going to just, tame those skin tones. But it is something that needs to be considered going in. This is something that it's kind of inescapable. The other aspect, some of the things that we were sort of finding from this process, and hopefully, in the imagery you can see here, across the middle of the sky here, there is some pretty nasty tearing artifacts. This is something that we encountered because of the way that the camera sensor, and unfortunately, all of your majors, your Arri, your Panavision, your Reds, your Sonys, they're all using this kind of sensor technology that can wreak havoc if the hardware that's feeding your wall imagery isn't specifically tuned for doing film work like this, if you don't have the appropriate sync dialed in. So this is one of those scenarios where we were finding that in the dark content in particular, and it's just a function of how the LED technology works, playing up with the way that the sensor in the camera is recording it, we found that in order to overcome this, we had to sort of brighten up our nighttime scenes, which mostly made that go away. And there were a few shots in the test that we did where we had to do a little bit of paint outs in post to alleviate that. The good news is that a higher quality sort of LED controller that is absolutely tuned for doing this kind of work makes this problem mostly a non-issue. But it is something, again, just to be aware, like as the content on the screen gets darker, your chance of seeing artifacts does go up a bit. The thing that's actually wonderful, though, that was really a pretty fantastic surprise about the process of doing this was on the day, we had a shot that was on the outside of the bomb aimer's station. We see him peering through the perspex here. And on this particular aircraft, you can see it in the second shot here, there is a flat surface of that spherical blister. I was thinking going into this, it'd be really great if we could actually get some reflections of the burning city on the ground, so far below. We weren't getting that on the day because, of course, there wasn't anything there on the floor. Until we sort of looked at it and realized that we had a couple of spare panels off on the side of the room. And I said to the guys, hey, do we think we can actually get something that we could put on the floor to reflect? And we just put a laser pointer at the camera, bounced it off that, and wherever the spot landed on the floor, I said, look, just give me a square meter of that LED panel, we'll put it on the floor. And within 30 minutes or so, suddenly we had something that worked perfectly for this setup. And it was the kind of actual ability to do that was a real surprise for me. And it was actually quite delightful that it was even possible that we didn't have to resort to doing this in post, which is kind of what, going into this shoot, I figured we were probably going to have to do. So that was the LED panel component of that shoot. But we also worked with a front projection setup. There were two angles that I had initially conceived for this that really wanted to be over the shoulder of that bomb aimer in the front section of the plane there and see what he was seeing through the window. But of course, in doing that, it would have meant that we would have needed to have LED panels on the floor of the stage. And given, again, that we didn't have this thing raised up on a 6-axis gimbal, it meant that it would have been impossibly close to the front of the plane section. We would have been seeing dots. And so as a way to try and counteract that, as an experiment, again, this whole test was about just trying things and seeing what works. What if we were to use a front projection setup? And for a couple of shots in this piece, that's exactly what you're seeing out the window. Was we had a laser projector that we brought in and fed that same content through onto a front projection screen that was just able to get a little bit further outside the window. The imagery that we got from that, I would say, wasn't the same caliber in terms of brightness and dynamic range that we were getting from the LEDs themselves, but it got us the shot, and we needed to do a little bit more work on that in the DI to resolve those, but we got the shot, and that was kind of the important thing. One of the things that was talked about in the previous discussion as well was the notion of putting up blue screens and green screens for occasional setups, and that was something we had looked at doing. We certainly had gone through the motions of putting something out there just to see if it worked. Ran a couple of takes just to get those in the can so we could experiment with it later. But again, that wasn't really the point of this test. I mean, everything about this experiment was what can we get in camera. We know we can composite. We've got a lot of years of experience of doing compositing in post. So I guess the front projection setup gives us a bit of a nice segue to Rosanne and Unter, because that ultimately is kind of the way that virtual production was used in Shadow in the Cloud.
Yep, cool. So if I give sort of a brief overview, and Rosanne, feel free to jump in and supplement here. Our early conversations about Shadow in the Cloud, spoiler, there's a monster. We had a lot of conversations about what the creature was going to be, and the creature is actually a bit of a metaphor as well. So we went pretty deep on his design and his role in the film, but we also realized that there's a good percentage where our hero is sort of trapped in the Sperry turret under a B-17. And so to give the world around her a bit more texture and to give the story a bit of a color script and a progression, there's sort of a, we came up with this bucket system where we categorized what was going to be out the window, and we're going to start in the dead of night, and we're going to work our way through. They reach altitude. They're at 6,000 feet. They're at 350 miles an hour, and they're flying through a thunderstorm over the Pacific, and then they get into a little bit clearer weather, and then we start to get into dawn, and we get into daylight, and the sort of revelations of the story progress alongside the sort of increased visibility. And as we're talking through that all made a lot of sense to me, except I wanted to go back to the record-scratching part where we're flying through an electrical storm at 6,000 feet, and we just weren't going to get that in a ship shooting aerial plates. So the plan then became that we would shoot plates for the various times of day and the various cloud densities and things that were actually feasible. But we were gonna, at Weta, we were gonna generate some nighttime thunderstorm skies, and that seesaw actually balanced out quite well, because the quality of the aerial plates that we got was great, and it was the more you sort of shine the literal harsh light of day on features of clouds, the more you want it to be realistic. Whereas with the thunderstorm stuff, we could get away with quite a bit. We've got a magic moon to give a little bit of shape, but otherwise we're in darkness and we're flashing lightning on here and there. We didn't have a whole lot of time or resource to build this. I think it probably came down to about 3 weeks worth, maybe a little bit more, of 3 artists' time. And so we did a quick test that was going to be clouds scrolling by and lightning flashes going off. And we output the lightning as a few different AOVs so that we could retime them in comp. We made the side-scrolling thunderstorm loopable so that we could stack them one after another and time the lightning differently and get a longer run out of it, because some of these shots were going to be quite long. I think the longest take was something like 11 minutes. Rosanne, I don't know if you remember that one. That might have been an aerial plate, but that was sort of the brief and what we were going to need to bring to the set. Before I jump into slides, Rosanne, do you want to add anything to that?
I think what was amazing for this situation was that we were under-resourced, and as you say, there was a time limit. And I think that's probably how it feels for every production, but there's probably more productions that work under these time and resource limits. So I was amazed that, you were able to make 9 clouds look like more, and all the different ways that we could time them and play them backwards and loop them, and all the things that we were able to stretch our resources out. And to me, the effect is completely perfect story-wise. It works for me, and I don't see it.
Cool. So this is sort of a little mock-up of the scenario that we had. We started with this curved 3-sided wall. We actually had an array of 10 projectors. So there were 4 on the floor that were sort of shooting up to cover the top of the screen, 5 around the top shooting down, and then an additional one that was covering the rest of the bottom. We had light panel array, with a series of sky panels, and we had our Sperry turret, Holly Go Lightly, which was on a gimbal and a shaker rig, and then we had a Alexa Mini on a crane. That was kind of it. So we basically worked out that we were going to need a number of different scenarios as we progressed through these buckets, and some of them were going to utilize the screen more than others. Some of them were going to use the entirety of the screen. And the first one up is pretty straightforward. It's a black screen and some smoke and a fan. And so this is the very beginning. She takes off. We're in really thick dead of night, and there's basically cloud rushing by. You'll notice we're not using the wall really at all. The lights on the ground are sort of simulating the runway lights as she's taking off, and then we could have switched into some of the lightning storm lighting through the Sperry turret windows, and of course that gives us interactive lighting with the smoke right outside the windows, and we get this kind of a look here. And so the other thing about the Sperry turret is that we could sort of orient it around. The orientation of it served 2 purposes. One was in terms of the story. She wasn't always facing forward or facing to the side or whatever. But then we could also pivot it around to, sort of make the best use of the stage that we had in terms of what we needed to put behind it and what sort of panels we needed to fly off of the turret. So this is our thunderstorm, our sort of side-scrolling lightning and thunder. And you can see we've got a little bit of leeway to sort of move the camera around without giving away the game that this is pre-rendered footage. And of course we could play this going either direction. We also did another version where we're flying into the cloud, and another one where it's receding so that we could play it for either the front or the back of the Sperry turret. And because that thing could reorient a full 90 degrees, we also had one that was looking down onto a top layer of cloud that we could project. With those 10 projectors, we could work with the projectionist and make the most of whatever sort of surface we needed, and we could sort of scale to make sure we had enough coverage for whatever lens was on the camera. And we did get a little bit of interactive lighting off of these, but we coupled that with the timing of the LED panels. At one point, we had talked about a fairly Soviet approach to triggering the lightning on set, and I was actually thinking like maybe some cigarette burns in the footage so the operator could time it, and we did a few tests and we realized that it wasn't, it just wasn't necessary, that the lightning in the thunderstorm footage and the lightning that the board operator was going to be triggering, it just all sort of played together chaotically and worked without needing to sort of integrate them, which was great because we didn't really have time to workflow that either. And so then this clip, we're starting to see a mixture of that black backdrop and the smoke and some of the thunderstorm skies. This here is a scenario we'll talk about in a second. And then, we've got the storm playing at the background and it's looping. Here we're into blue screen because we're extending the plane and we didn't have camera-specific renders. And there you're actually getting a little bit of reflection off of the three-sided render coming back into the windows as we're shooting from outside the Sperry. This is where we're using traditional blue screen because for our low angles, we're looking up and we're seeing the underbelly of a B-17 that's not there. And we're shooting off the top of the projection surface. So for those scenarios and a few others, we did what would be really familiar. We didn't have anything like a ceiling where I think we're actually maxed out on the stage here with the height of all our lighting and the top of the surface. And then we start to get into creature work, and we're gonna actually be using the wall as a blue screen. You would have noticed in that previous clip maybe that, again, I sort of did it intentionally, even in that diagram, you are seeing where the evenness of the lighting on the practical blue screen starts to fall off, whereas if you project a blue screen, you can sort of control the values a bit more and you get a much more constant, more keyable blue to work with. And so we had a number of different blues that we could project. I did some tests in terms of the luminance and what was going to be appropriate. We had one that sort of filled the space so we could move the camera around a little bit more. Of course, that leads to a bit of spill, so we used that pretty sparingly. But we had different size blues, and I had made a few actually sort of at my magliner on my Mac, just threw together different configurations of tracking markers that we could quickly throw up onto the screen because the art department actually created extra windows in the Sperry turret beyond what would have really been there so that we could always be seeing some sky out the back. But what that meant was I was sort of constantly trying to anticipate where the markers would be visible. So I had some blues that were really dense with tracking markers and some that were more sparse depending on the lens, depending if the door was open, depending what size of the window. Obviously that front viewing window, you could see a lot more. And then we also had parallax poles that we would use that we would bring in and just leave a constant blue on the screen. So there were a number of different scenarios. It would have been really tricky for the time we had to be trying to place specific tracking markers onto the blue through the projectionist workflow. And it was pretty essential that we had tracking markers because the camera was on the move and the Sperry turret was constantly on the move. It was always at least shaking. And we had these really tight shots, so there was never any kind of frame of reference to where we were in the world. So that was more of a added insurance for being able to track those shots. And then we have a scenario like this where our creature is front and center. And we're cutting back and forth. When we're looking at our hero, we've got actual aerial plate behind her. And when we cut back to our guy in the foreground just outside the window, we're all CG. So we're blue out there, and he's so close to the plane, he's actually going to interact with the glass here at the end of this little clip that we just decided to go more traditional on this angle. But I think it cuts back and forth quite well, and the whole run of scenes where Chloe is in the turret, we're using all these different techniques, and quite often jumping from one technique to another in adjacent shots. You might have 4 shots in a row, and there's 3 of those different techniques represented. And the scenario that we're shooting actually played quite well to that. So this is an example very similar to the thunderstorm footage where we're projecting one of our various aerial plates, and even those had been graded a few different ways to play at different times of day, even though it was the same footage. And then we're also doing, some interactive lighting tricks, lights on jibs to sort of imply that the plane is turning or banking as we're progressing through the story. So you get a bit of that here. And again, we're just in front of the aerial plate projected behind her. And then this was sort of like our big setup where we had rendered a spherical render traveling through clouds, and then we just sort of worked out the alignment of what of that we were going to use to fill the whole curved surface. And this one didn't loop, so we had a certain duration that was going to be usable, but we could get shots like this where we were just sort of moving around and taking advantage of that full curved surface. We didn't have like a Hydra, like a multi-camera rig on the helicopter for when we shot the aerial plates, so we weren't going to be able to stitch together anything from the aerial shoot that would have filled more than sort of an orthographic view within that surface. So the CG Thunderstorm was actually the thing that played the most there in terms of making use of that space. The last thing to kind of mention is that for as clean as all these sort of diagnostics look, this was the Lidar that we got at the end of shooting in that space, and you can see it's still very much a film set. There's the blue screen off to the side, there's a stack of C-stands. I mean, this is actually quite cleaned up. This is myself and the survey guy going through after wrap and tidying everything up so we could get as clean a Lidar as possible. But you'll notice the crane's not there, the camera's not there, the crew is not there. The steel deck that the creature performer is not there, and it's still quite a tight space. I think we kind of thought of it that if Chloe was trapped in that turret, we were all trapped on that stage. And the projectionist would come in every morning and he would sort of grumble about how one of the projectors had been kicked at some point by the special effects guy while he was shaking the turret, and you could see the wall sort of deteriorating, and we'd try to lay carpets down if people were going to have to be walking back there. And the lighting, all the C-stands, my parallax poles, like everything was constantly being moved around, and everybody started out being really respectful of the wall and trying to not to scuff it or damage it. And by the end, it was, it basically was a piece of equipment on the set like anything else, like the Antares or the fans or any of the sky panels. We put it through its paces, and this is a bit of witness camera footage where you can kind of see the reality of what was happening there. And so Tim Wong was our creature performer, and he's sort of right in there. He's up on deck, and we've got the camera on a crane, and we've got lights everywhere. And you can see that we're projecting blue on the screen behind, and we're getting that in the raw scan of the plate. So we've got a really clean blue screen. So even when we're not flying through clouds or thunderstorms or whatever, we're still making use of the technology to get a better key off something like this, where there's hair and there's chain and a lot of frenetic activity, and a foam claw.
And so in that last instance, was it just like a small patch of blue enough to cover you, and then you were still using the rest of the sky for illumination?
No, because the LED panels were doing a lot of the heavy lifting for the lightning, and that was sort of a very specific scenario. So any lightning flash, we wanted to be able to time it and not sort of hope for a happy accident with the footage lightning. And also the lightning in the footage, it was contributing in terms of like helping us with reflections and a little bit of sort of ambient variation, but I wouldn't have wanted to rely on the projection stuff for selling that we're like deep into a electrical storm. Yeah. So for something like that where we've got Tim in there and there's heavy interaction, it was a bit more traditional. And then the blue screen, we did our best to cover, make sure we weren't over covering to the point that we're getting spill in a negative sort of way.
So let me ask you, with both of you having worked on different types of low budget projects, right? So this is, Usually when we think of large-scale volumes and large-scale virtual production shoots, we think of Avatar, we think of Lion King or Jungle Book. In these two cases, in these two instances, both of you are working within the confines and the restrictions that a more low-budget filmmaker would encounter. What would be some of the workflow recommendations or thought processes or even creative processes that you would recommend to directors going in now that you've sort of played around with this and now that we've had some exposure and we're really working through finessing this, this workflow? What would you recommend to filmmakers that they think about at the front end of a shoot?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say for the test that we did with the LED walls, one of the things I didn't mention earlier was that, you know, that was what we did, what we got in camera was a quite constrained, sort of claustrophobic almost, you know, sequence. And the fact that we didn't have the wide establishing shots showing you, you know, who's where and all that, you're not necessarily getting the sort of the variety of shots that you really want to construct a scene like that out of. And so the thing is going into this is that you really, you know, you're not setting out to try and do everything with this tech. You're gonna mix it up a bit. You're going to want to you know, add in the shots that aren't in camera. You know, maybe there was a full CG moment here, or maybe there was an aerial plate that we would have just added in some aircraft into, to just give the thing some scope, and we didn't have that opportunity. I mean, I did with the gang across the street here. I did, you know, do some virtual scouting in VR as we were setting up with this, you know, and there were a dozen amazing angles that would have been this really fantastic air-to-air kind of vibe that we couldn't do either because it would have meant that there was a wing in the foreground of the set piece that we were shooting. Obviously, you're not going to get that in camera, so now you're into a visual effects process again. There were, you know, or there were shots that you really wanted to be kind of high, looking down across these guys. At that point, now you're seeing the ground, and we knew we weren't going to have enough panel coverage, certainly on the ground, you know, to give us that kind of thing. And so you really, yeah, it's sort of about giving yourself the variety. And I'm not sure about Rosanne and Unter, like.
Yeah, I mean, and Rosanne, you should speak to this. But the one thing I'll say was that it was extremely helpful and basically essential that we stuck to our plan, and you had sort of bought off on what we were going to be projecting and the progression of the story and the spaces that we were moving through. We were able to prepare exactly what we needed and make the most of our brief lead-in time. But you should definitely speak to that a bit more.
If I had 4 words to say to any filmmaker embarking on this on limited resources, it's fix it and prep. That's the key. Fix it and prep, and then you'll save money and you'll enjoy the process a lot more. And we did really well with what we had, but you know, at the same time we probably would, there'd be some optimizations that we'd do again. I'm not. I think that's the same for every production, no matter across a large range of budget levels and scopes as well. Yeah, I think working together, like from my perspective as a director, that it's my job to be the guardian of the story and the believability of everything. So seeing everything work in concert with each other, so that space felt a lot smaller than the Lidar that you just showed. And my memory of it was completely different. It was pretty down and dirty, and yeah, quite frenetic, I guess. And my memory of you is kind of like just working away in the background, and occasionally you'd pop up and be like, "Hey guys, I need my time to do this thing." It would really help us in post-production. But the rest of the time, you know, I was kind of working with what was in front of me, which was the action, and yeah, and the concert, I guess, the concert of special effects. Like, I felt like it was really important. You were saying that there's some burly artist guys who were shaking the thing. The shaking really helped in concert with what we were seeing outside the windows. That to me, that makes it for me. That helps build the illusion. And so, yeah, if we can all communicate with each other, if we can all be a team, if we can all understand everybody's job, ideally that's the best thing. I don't want to just do my thing in my own silo. The whole project works better when I know why you're doing what you're doing, and I know why art department's doing what they're doing, why specials are doing what they're doing. And in a way, the art department guys needed to learn the script, right? Because we were queuing thunder and shakes. We even had a seismic chart across the script, which sort of was the key for the art department guys to be shaking their thing and cued with the lighting and the yeah. So the more we know about everybody's job, the better we work as a team.
Yep, and I mean some of that stuff where we've got the fog on, you know, blowing right past the Sperry turret, you're getting that conforming to the shape of the turret, and you're getting the lightning and lighting generally that's coming through the windows, and lighting our talent is interacting with that fog. So it's nice to have that element of the practical when we're in that tight space. That I had to put a really wide lens to show that little round of the lidar, so it was a pretty tight space. The other thing I'd say is that I don't. I was trying to articulate this with Erik yesterday, that the sort of the complexity of what you want to show on the screen doesn't sort of ramp linearly. Like, I think you can go from something that's really achievable in a relatively short amount of time with limited resource to something that is going to be really difficult and really time intensive very quickly. You don't have to sort of wander to get there. You can stray into the very difficult or resource intensive very quickly. And you know, we had the good fortune of traveling through cloud at night in a lightning storm, no less. And I think our sort of day-to-day experience of that, and every time I would fly up to Auckland, I remember, Rosanne, I would show you new iPhone footage of, like, this is what the cloud looked like this time on my way up to prep. And you know, it's interesting that when you really look at it, you realize you don't have a daily frame of reference for certain things that you experience constantly. You don't think, oh, that cloud doesn't look right, or that cloud is 1.3 kilometers long. I can tell by looking at it. Whereas if you're driving down a street, you know if the mailbox doesn't look right because you interact with it, and you know what the people moving around it, how big they should be, and you start to build a lot more complexity really quickly. If you were, say, trying to do a scene where you're driving through Manhattan, you know, I just think of that last shot of Michael Clayton, how many resources, how many assets you would need to build into that to be projecting something like that. If you didn't have a plate of it out the back of the cab, you could really quickly get yourself into a lot of work, because you can't loop it, and you can't have it devoid of people and any number of other things that would sort of increase the complexity.
Well, I think that's something that directors kind of need to find out about, actually, is that a small change, something that is practically very easy to ask for, becomes exponentially more difficult with VFX and workflows. That when you explain it to me like that, that makes complete sense. The fact that we were in the air makes all the difference, because we could loop stuff and no one would be able to tell one cloud from the other. But the thing that you're talking about, mailboxes and frames of reference and stuff, that makes complete sense. But as a director, you know, I come from my own experience, so I can't tell straight away I think this happened quite a lot, where I asked for something that seemed very simple to me but was very difficult for you, and you'd be like, no, we can't do that because these reasons. And so that literacy is something that comes through only through doing, I think, as a director.
Great, thank you. That's very well said. I have like maybe two quick questions, if we may, before we wrap up. and any of you could answer this. The first one is, I'm sure a lot of the audience members would like to know, how do you know if my project is a good candidate for virtual production? Can you discuss the types of scenes it's good for?
I guess I would say maybe a simple answer to that is, how confident can you be going into your shoot? How much prep time have you given yourself to make the imagery that you're going to be putting, in that volume on those walls, whatever the technology may be? The real benefit of this getting in a camera is saying it's done. Like, this is final pixel, and we're not going to go back and change our mind about what color the sky is, or, oh no, there should be two monsters back there, not one. As soon as you start getting into that, you start getting into all the complexities that you would have had you shot it on location. So the more as filmmakers you can sort of have a very clear vision going into a project. Yes, I know exactly what this wants to look like. Our production designer has come up with this amazing artwork and blah, 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 blah. Maybe this is a good sort of candidate for this technology. Whereas if you kind of sense that if your workflow is such that you kind of feel like you want to have some time to explore and try things in post, this may not be a very good fit for you, and a traditional visual effects pipeline may be more interesting, because there's a big gap, or sort of kind of a broad range of options between going full-blown immersive, LED volume, and going, we're just going to slap a blue screen up and try and make this work. I mean, there are lots of options where you can still use, for example, an array of sky panels that are still being pixel mapped with virtual content, just to give you the appropriate lighting on your actor. And maybe whether that's LED volume or whether that's more of a traditional, there's just a green screen back there, and you're using interactive lighting that's changing dynamically as it goes, if they're supposed to be in an environment that's changing, or if they're in a traveling, if they're actually moving through space or something. There are a lot of options between those extremes, that may be a good fit for a particular project. It doesn't have to be all or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Well, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that I think if you start to look at the way LED technology and virtual production technology gets integrated into the overall filmmaking process, you can start to think about some genres work well with this. It's, as Erik just sort of alluded to, if you start to pre-plan your movie and you're able to commit to decisions up front, and you understand the limitations of your resources, you can work with that, and LED workflow works very well for your project. But if you're crafting a film where you're looking for those moments of spontaneity and moments of serendipity, and you're trying to craft your film through editorial, I don't think that LED technology will work for you as well, unless it's a known static image. But for any sort of large-scale productions or small-scale productions where you have an idea of what you want to put on that content, it can be a powerful tool for filmmakers.
And just, I would add just the last thing. I think it's important early on just to have a conversation with visual effects, with the people who are going to be responsible for putting that content up, if that seems like it might be an option, because there are some subtleties to what the story is trying to achieve that might actually make something that seems complex a bit more straightforward, or vice versa. And I think, just saying like, oh well, we're in a diner, so it's not going to work because there's going to be people walking by outside or whatever. I don't know that it's safe to assume one way or the other that the concept alone can answer the question if it's right or not, because I think there's still plenty of undiscovered territory here, and I think there's going to be things that we work out, and we're gonna come into some scenarios where it's just not you just couldn't go to a spreadsheet and say, well, it doesn't check these boxes, so it's not going to work, because it might. And I think just a few early conversations could really reveal that actually it is an option.
So really sitting down with your director in pre-production, you can go through the script and decide what scenes might work good for it and what scenes might not, because probably the whole movie is not all going to be LED projection. You're going to pick and choose what scenes would be good to have the LED wall in the background, right?
Exactly.
That's
So
right.
a lot of that I think is important in the prep for the directors to work with the team and to figure that out in pre-production.
I'd
Exactly.
almost say work with your VFX, if you have VFX people, work with them in development.
Yeah.
I would say bring it in early, yeah, because then it can inform your writing. And you're always going to be writing to a budget. You're always going to be writing to some limits. And whatever those are, you write to. So as the technology and cost changes, those capabilities will also change. So I would also recommend checking in always with your collaborators if you have them, or finding them if you don't.
And you're right. And I think a lot of that, what I think people tend to forget, because they're so used to working in post-production and visual effects, that LED virtual production is really the few months or whatever it takes up front to do all that planning up front. So you can have final pixel in camera and not have to do all the post-production decision making at the end. It's just a different workflow, a different way of working that we're trying to share with our DGA members.
Yep. Agreed.
And then I have one more, if I have time, maybe not. I have one more quick question. And I don't know if this could be a quick answer, but sometimes you'll see the entire LED screen, and sometimes you'll see a small green screen just behind the actor in front of the LED wall set. Can you explain briefly why would you want to add this small green screen behind the actor? Can someone do a brief
Sure.
answer?
I mean, it sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's like if there's any doubt about what exactly is going to be behind the actor, in the final result, that's a great way to still get the benefit of the illumination, to give your cast a sense of where they're supposed to be, where they're standing, what is the world I'm in, who's around me, where is the monster, whatever the questions are, those things can still be answered, even if, if for example, you get to your shoot and you haven't quite gotten to a place where you're happy with what you're seeing, as a filmmaker. Well, at that point, you're probably gonna have to do some further work in post, but at least you've got a representation. It may not be the final version of what you're doing, but maybe it's 80% of the way there, whatever. At least you've got something for everybody to kind of get immersed into that world. But if you give yourself just that little patch of chroma key screen behind them, now your VFX team can extract them in a high quality way that doesn't require like an army of rotoscope artists, to cut them all out, because that's the thing we're absolutely trying to avoid with this process, right?
You're right, well said. We'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our insightful speakers from the creative team from The Mandalorian and Weta Digital for imparting their wisdom today. Also, we'd like to give a special thanks to Greg Brilliant and Dave Boucher, who helped coordinate the presenters for this event. As was a big thank you to the DGA Special Projects Committee and staff, and especially Brandon Goko for all of his help and support. Thank you to everyone who contributed their time, talent, and energy to make this possible. And thank you for attending our virtual production seminar.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks
everyone.
very much.
having
Thanks,
us.
DGA.